Yes, today I will be speaking about Mykhailo Hrushevsky in history and legend. My voice is a little bit weak today because I have a sore throat, so I won't read the entire paper, but I'll read parts of it and summarize other parts. So, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, as you probably know, was undoubtedly one of the most important Ukrainians of the 20th century. Greatest of modern Ukrainian historians, most active and influential organizer of Ukrainian modern scholarship and higher learning, the most celebrated spokesman for Ukrainian autonomy and a decentralizing federalism in pre-revolutionary Russia, and the man who in 1917 to 18 headed the Ukrainian National Parliament, the Centralna Rada, and, as is universally acknowledged, was the father, Batko, of his people, and led the Rada to proclaim the full independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, of which he became the first president. When this republic was destroyed by the Bolsheviks, Hrushevsky became a symbol of Ukrainian independence and emigration, and even after his return to Soviet Ukraine in 1924, remained the single most important cultural figure in the country, almost to his death in 1934. Hrushevsky's life and work left an indelible imprint upon Ukrainian history, politics, and identity. And from very early in his career, he became a symbol of the Ukrainian national movement, to be admired and praised by his supporters, and hated and attacked by his enemies. In fact, throughout most of the rest of the 20th century, that is, as long as the Soviet Union existed and Ukrainian national aspirations went unfulfilled, Hrushevsky was a subject of both history and legend. The shades of this history and these legends have still not completely dissipated today. Hrushevsky was born in Kholm, a mixed Ukrainian and Polish border region just to the northwest of today's Ukraine. And he was raised in the Caucasus, in Georgia, where he read Ukrainian journals and was educated in part by his father, who was a local patriot of sorts, the author of a famous textbook of Slavonic that was used throughout the Russian Empire. As a result of this, the Hrushevsky family, because of the royalties from the book, became very, very wealthy. And Hrushevsky was known throughout his life, at least till his return, well, till his exile from Ukraine in 1919, as a wealthy man. It's also been stated that this early childhood away from Ukraine, this education away from Ukraine, gave him a kind of romantic idea about what Ukraine was all about and of the Ukrainian national awakening of the 19th century. And some people, some historians later on criticized him for this, saying his idea of what Ukraine was totally unrealistic and he had no real contact with the country in his early years. Others, of course, have disputed this. Anyhow, he got his higher education at the University of Kiev under the famous historian Vladimir, who was not romantic at all. In fact, he was what they call a positivist, a documentalist who stuck closely to documents and throughout his life was famous as the publisher of many, many older documents on Ukrainian history. This very rigorous training in documentalist history marks all of Hrushevsky's work, all of his professional work. So on the one hand, you have the romantic nationalist, allegedly, and on the other, you have the positivist historian and the realist. Anyhow, he graduated from university with his master's degree in 1894 and was immediately appointed to the chair of Ukrainian history at the University of Lemberg in Austrian Galicia. This was done as a result of an agreement between the Poles and the Ukrainians in Galicia, and between the Ukrainians in Galicia and the Ukrainians in Kiev. It was a kind of a compromise agreement in which the Poles conceded some factors to the Ukrainian population of Galicia in return for a social peace. It didn't quite work out that way, but Hrushevsky did get his chair and taught from 1894 onward right up until 1914. While in Galicia, he was enormously successful. He was very energetic, very dedicated to the cause, and very skilled at what he was doing. His magnum opus, the Historia Ukraina Russa, was begun there. He published 8 volumes there, these big fat volumes. You can see the translations of one of them right here, before the First World War. And 2 volumes, I believe, also came out in Russian before the First World War. So he was very, very prolific in that sense. He was also the first person to get moving a literary journal of the modern European type called Literaturno Naukowy Wysnek. And in this journal, the most prominent Ukrainian writers of the time published, including Ivan Franko, who was Hrushevsky's very close collaborator during this time. Hrushevsky also drafted into his work, both in the journal and in the more scholarly one, the Zapiski of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, his students, and practically any intellectual they know. He drafted into the work into work on these projects, and the result was a real flowering of the Ukrainian national awakening in eastern Galicia. Now, I have a quote here from Ivan Franko as to how Hrushevsky changed things at the Shevchenko Scientific Society. Franko wrote at the time, and this is in the 1890s, "Whoever might ascribe to himself the service of reforming the Shevchenko Scientific Society, this one thing must be said. The service of organizing the scholarly work belongs firmly to Professor Hrushevsky, a man of wide learning, unbreakable will, and inexhaustible energy. He unites in himself the seriousness and criticism of a scholarly historian, a youthful enthusiasm for the cause of the elevation of his native people, and a love of labor and forbearance that can only be truly valued by those who know in all its fullness that Galician quagmire into which the young professor who had just arrived from Ukraine was headed, and with which he had to fight with all the means of intelligent pedagogy. In the course of this, he had to survive thousands of unpleasantries and neutralize formal battles, which on one occasion even led to a crisis that threatened to destroy the entire venture. He was able to put himself above all petty intrigues, party and factional antagonisms. Without looking at their party position, he was able to introduce into the society all persons inspired with the idea of the Ukrainian Renaissance and enthusiastic about important work. And this benefited the common cause and was the reason for the growth of that maturity and tolerance which makes possible the concentration of different types and different shades of opinion in a common task." And that's Franko speaking. Anyhow, this success in Galicia, which was looked upon as a kind of a piedmont, a footstool to which to step higher up onto the national stage, was followed in 1905 by a transfer of this activity to the Russian Empire, where until 1904 there was very strict censorship of things Ukrainian, especially the Ukrainian language. Hrushevsky took advantage of the loosening of the censorship to shift the emphasis of his work eastward. Firstly to Kiev, where he founded a number of scholarly institutions, and then also to St. Petersburg, where he became the advisor to the Ukrainian club in the Russian Duma, the parliament of the Russian Empire. One of his first achievements at that time was a brief textbook called Ocherk Historii Ukrainskого Naroda. This Russian language textbook was one of his favorite books. He revised it many times during his life. It was short, incisive, and quite successful. Unfortunately, it's never been translated into English, unlike his Illustrovana Historia Ukraina, which has been, and is not quite as incisive or well written as the Russian one. A second important essay that he wrote at this time was called The Traditional Scheme of Russian History and the Problem of a Rational Organization of the History of the Eastern Slavs. And this essay appeared under the imprint of the prestigious Russian Academy of Sciences. So it was and it was written in Ukrainian, so it raised the prestige of the Ukrainian language quite a bit when it was first published. as well as setting forth a logical framework for the development of Ukrainian history. Now, at this time, Hrushevsky became known as the leader of the Ukrainian national movement in the Russian Empire. He advised the Ukrainian Club in the Duma. He was the head of all these organizations in Kiev. He was the big professor from Lviv. So he was the one who unified the country. He was the one who the Russian nationalists targeted as the enemy of the Russian Empire. In general, we can say that the first great myth about Hrushevsky, the first great legend about Hrushevsky, a negative one, was that he was the head Mazepist, and that's what he was called. He was called the heresiarch, the arch-heretic. And Shchegolov, the Russian imperial censor in Kiev, who wrote a big, thick book about the Ukrainian national movement, said that he thought, quote, and I quote again, "The magical hand of Hrushevsky," unquote, "lies behind every manifestation of the Ukrainian national movement in the Russian Empire." Anyhow, by 1907, the revolution had run its course, and political reaction began to set in. Pressure was built on the Ukrainian movement. It became more difficult to publish and more difficult to organize. This reached a crescendo in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. Hrushevsky, of course, was a Russian citizen, a Russian subject by birth, and he remained so during his entire time in the Austrian Empire. Significant fact. So he didn't feel comfortable in Austria when the war broke out. So what did he do? He went to neutral Italy, and from neutral Italy he returned to the Russian Empire. In the Russian Empire, immediately upon his arrival in Kiev, he was arrested. Not entirely unexpected, given his reputation among the Russian imperial authorities. He was sent off to, it was supposed to be Siberia, but somebody sympathetic to the Ukrainian movement changed the letter, inserted the letter M in the document ordering his deportation. And instead of being sent to Siberia, he was sent to Simbirsk, which was much closer to Ukraine. After a couple of years there, he got permission to move to Kazan, which had a university, and then later to Moscow itself. Now, why was he allowed to go to Kazan and later to Moscow? Not because of anything that the Ukrainians did so much, but rather he became a hero of the Russian liberal intelligentsia. He was the foremost federalist, the foremost democrat in Ukraine, and the Russian press lobbied, and his friends in the Russian Academy of Sciences lobbied in St. Petersburg for his release. And of course he was, and he got to Moscow, where he worked together with Simon Petlura in the Russian language journal Ukrainskaya Zhizn. And then, of course, in 1917, the revolution breaks out. Once again, Hrushevsky becomes the leader of the Ukrainian national movement, moves back to Kiev, where he becomes known at this time as Batko Hrushevsky. In the Centralna Rada, he becomes the foremost, the central figure, the Holova, or president as he's sometimes translated. He runs it very, very well. He keeps order. The members of the deputies are very well behaved. There are orderly discussions of the hottest questions of the day. And Hrushevsky's reputation as a parliamentarian rises. At this time, his commitment to parliamentary democracy comes out very clearly. His commitment and friendship with the socialist revolutionaries, the Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, becomes obvious. He is sympathetic to the peasantry. He's on the left wing. He consorts with the youngest revolutionaries around, and some of his older friends become put off by this. Others are are completely appalled, especially the more conservative landowners from Poltava province and other provinces in Ukraine, which could not understand why Hrushevsky suddenly was going to the left so sharply. Anyhow, this continued until the defeat of the Central Rada and the attack of the Bolsheviks, which was a traumatic experience for Hrushevsky. First, the Central Rada collapsed before the Bolsheviks had to run west, returned with the help of the Germans, which was a terrible blow to Hrushevsky because all his life he was accused of being Austrophile and Germanophile, and here he was returning to Kiev with the help of the Germans. It was a terrible embarrassment for him, from which he never really recovered. Anyhow, when the Bolsheviks attacked, he penned this statement, which I think I should read to you because it's crucial. This is right after the bombing of his house and the attack of the Bolsheviks in Kiev. He wrote, "People have been blown to pieces, but so have ideas. Not only have cities been destroyed, but so have traditions. Much has been consumed in this great conflagration, and much will be yet. People are coming out of it renewed, and they look at the world with new eyes. Among other things, the historic, cultural, economic, and other ties between the Ukrainian and the great Russian peoples are being burned up. The history of these two brotherly peoples seem to be reaching that stage which the Slavic brothers, the Ukrainians and the Poles, reached earlier on. Previously, the Ukrainian people had to deal with a bureaucracy and government which the great Russian society to some degree rejected. Now, we have the self-evident fact of the struggle between the great Russian and Ukrainian peoples themselves. One attacks, the other defends itself." So we can see how important this was, this year in the life of Hrushevsky. Although we know him today as the great historian and the great scholar and that sort of thing. And in our library here in this institute, there's a statue of Hrushevsky sitting with his cane, very dignified. But he was also a political leader, and this was the political crisis of his life. Anyhow, things did not work out. The Rada was overthrown in a conservative coup led by Pavlo Skoropadsky and with German support, and was eventually overthrown, and Hrushevsky himself had to flee west, and he wound up in Vienna. In Vienna, he didn't have the resources that he had in Ukraine. He didn't have the sources to continue his historical work, so he turned to literature. And he began in Vienna his great Historia Ukrainskoi Literatura, 5 volumes of which came out during his lifespan. It was a difficult time for Hrushevsky. He was very poor. He relied on Ukrainians in the West, here in Canada and in the United States, for financial support. And he struggled on and was known as the leader of the Vienna group of the Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, the SRs. Anyhow, at this time, the Soviet government, after a few years of quite severe repressions against Ukrainian things, began its policy of korenizatsiya, nativization, which in Ukraine was interpreted as Ukrainianization. And the new economic policy was proclaimed economically. So many emigres thought that this was a compromise and they could return home to either Russia or Ukraine, and the Ukrainians began to return to Russia, especially the left-wingers. Most of Hrushevsky's group, in fact almost all of them I think, returned to Ukraine, and Hrushevsky himself did in 1924. At this time, these accusations against him by the right wing became ferocious. He was accused of being a weak-needs pacifist, of being a socialist, of being a federalist, all of which were unrealistic at the time, in the opinion of these right-wingers. And so the legend of Hrushevsky, the weak-kneed pacifist, was born. The man who had disbanded the Ukrainian army in the midst of the revolution in the face of both Bolshevik militarism. But this return and also, I should say, most importantly, he was accused of being a traitor to the national cause, returning to Ukraine under the Bolsheviks. But what he did when he returned to Kiev was amazing. He worked out a deal with the Soviet government that he would return for scholarly work. And in return, he would stay out of politics and they would leave him alone. At the same time, many of his former colleagues, these young SRs, held positions in the Soviet Ukrainian government, in particular a man by the name of Alexander Shumsky, who was the Minister of Education. Now, these people trusted Hrushevsky, liked Hrushevsky, were his followers, and supported him throughout the 1920s. The result was Hrushevsky had the financial and organizational support to produce a real flowering of Ukrainian culture in Kiev in the 1920s. This was the time when he completed the next volumes of his great Historia Ukraina Russa. This was the time when the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, the Всеукраїнська Академія Наук, was flourishing. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, this is usually mistranslated. Всеукраїнська does not mean all Ukrainian, it means pan-Ukrainian. It means Ukrainian for Soviet Ukraine and for Western Ukraine under the Poles or under the Czechs or whatever. Pan-Ukrainian, not all Ukrainian. So I'm hoping one day that we'll see this change of translation occur in our encyclopedias and elsewhere. Anyhow, Hrushevsky was very successful during these years. He founded the journal Ukraina. Not only continued his great history, but also continued his great history of literature, and trained a whole series of cadres of young Ukrainian intelligence to work for the national cause. But by 1930, Stalin had consolidated his power. There were purges in Russia and Ukraine, and there was a turn against Ukrainizatsiya, against the Ukrainian movement. Hrushevsky himself was accused of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism, of inventing a false theory of the classlessness of the Ukrainian people, as it was put, and of leading all the scholars in Ukraine who opposed the Marxists on what they called the historical front. This was the beginning of still another great myth about Hrushevsky, the Soviet myth of Hrushevsky as the bourgeois nationalist and, quote, the implacable enemy of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. In 1931, he was arrested, taken to Kharkiv, where he was tortured. Then mysteriously he was released and sent to Moscow, where he lived under close supervision and had to report to the NKVD every week. Nevertheless, even in Moscow, he was very productive. He couldn't publish in Ukrainian, so he published in Russian journals, but on Ukrainian subjects, and the quality was still very, very high. In 1934, I should also mention that Katerina, his daughter, was very important to him during this period. Hrushevsky by this time was almost blind. He couldn't read himself. So he would order documents, and she would read them for him, and then he'd dictate. And that's how he produced the last volume of his History of Ukrainian Literature and these other articles in Russian, with the help of his daughter, who was a scholar in her own right, I might add, a folklorist and an anthropologist. Anyhow, in 1934, he received permission to go to Kislovodsk in the Caucasus for a holiday. Well, there, however, he became ill and had to have an operation. Although a physician friend of the family was readily available, the doctor in charge insisted on performing the operation himself against the wishes of the family. Hrushevsky only got worse and unexpectedly died. Although recent research has revealed that the Soviet political police kept a very close watch on all of this, it is still unknown whether the doctor's scalpel intentionally cut too deep, or whether the great historian died a natural death. No document actually ordering Hrushevsky's death has yet been uncovered, and possibly never will be. The manner of the historian's death remains one of the greatest mysteries of his most controversial biography. And I'd like to just read the last part, if I can make it through. Excuse me, my voice is very weak today. The great significance of this complex biography, this much controverted life story, was immediately apparent to Hrushevsky's contemporaries and continued to be appreciated, though much confounded by propaganda and legend throughout the long years of the existence of the USSR. To his Ukrainian admirers and supporters, Hrushevsky was indeed a father, the great scholar who had proclaimed the existence and demonstrated the historicity of an independent Ukrainian people. Thereafter, he translated this claim into political terms and oversaw the construction of a free Ukrainian national state, the Ukrainian People's Republic, during the revolution. This he did without ever compromising his democratic and socialist principles. By contrast, to his conservative Ukrainian critics and to the integral nationalists who were especially prominent during the 1930s and the 1940s, Hrushevsky was the impractical ideologue whose improbable theories about socialism, federalism, and democracy had ruined Ukraine's chance for independence during the revolution. Some of these critics thought he was a good historian, but a poor politician. Others even rejected his histories as being too revolutionary in content and preparing the ground for the destruction during the revolution of the patriotic Ukrainian landowning classes and the educated elite. These critics basically saw Hrushevsky as a populist and an anarchist who in every respect failed the Ukrainian nation. And I think you can see a reflection of this attitude even in the works of the renowned founder of the Harvard Institute, Emilian Prymak, who related to me personally when I interviewed him many years ago, some of this kind of attitude. But perhaps Professor Sisson will be able to speak to that point later on, as he knew him much better than I ever did. While this controversy continued within the Ukrainian community in the West, and throughout the 20th century in Soviet Ukraine itself, Hrushevsky's works were suppressed, and his name was largely banned from the history books. Whenever it was mentioned, it had to be preceded by a series of negative adjectives. The situation continued unabated until the late 1980s, when Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev announced his program of glasnost and perestroika. And then in 1991, when Ukraine finally gained national independence. Suddenly, Hrushevsky became the hero of the hour. Streets and academic institutions were renamed in his honor, and statues created. His works were reprinted in large print runs, and his reputation as Ukraine's greatest scholar restored. Moreover, the Ukrainian People's Republic of 1917 to 18 and Hrushevsky, its first president, were seen as predecessors of the independent Ukraine, which emerged in '91. He became a quasi-official national hero. Now, despite the myths and the controversy surrounding his person, throughout the 20th century, the view steadily strengthened that Hrushevsky should be grouped together with Shevchenko and Franco as one of the three greatest Ukrainians of modern times. Current developments in independent Ukraine confirm this view. However, for scholars in the West, concerned with evaluating Hrushevsky's position in history, he can be placed in a wider context. In the middle of the 20th century, Louis Namier, a British historian of Jewish background from eastern Galicia, that is the Ukrainian part of Galicia, pointed out that while in Western Europe, where merchants and professional politicians provided political leadership in modern times, in Central and Eastern Europe, this role was filled by scholars and intellectuals. An archetype of this phenomenon was the Czech historian Franciszek Polatsky, who announced the existence of an independent Czech nation and held a prominent place in European history, in the European history of the revolutions of 1948. Hrushevsky, too, played such a role. In the absence of professional politicians in central Ukraine in 1917 to 18, The great historian Mykhailo Hrushevsky attempted to lead his people through the turmoil of those revolutionary times and clearly announced their existence to a somewhat surprised outside world. Though his two great histories, the Historia Ukraina Russe and the Historia Ukrainskoye Literatura, were left uncompleted at the time of his death, and his ultimate political goals, democratic and national, remained partially unfulfilled, Hrushevsky's fundamental announcement was accepted by most of his contemporaries, even to some extent by his main opponents, the Bolsheviks, who acknowledged the existence of the Ukrainian people. And through this, Hrushevsky's name was indelibly written into the history of 20th century Europe. But his story is unfinished and it's still unfolding today. So thank you very much.